Single mom had nothing, until her child revealed a secret that changed the judge's mind. She stood alone in court, no lawyer, no support, just a mother's love, and 2 children she was about to lose. Her ex-husband came armed with money, lies, and a team of professionals. She had nothing, except her 7-year-old son. And when he rose to speak, the courtroom froze because in his tiny hands was a letter that shattered every lie. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where we tell stories that pierce the darkness with truth, love, and the quiet courage that changes lives. If you're new here, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep bringing real stories that matter, that move, and that remind us what we're truly made of. What was in that letter? Why did a child have to be the one to tell the truth no adult dared speak? Stay with us as we unfold a story of betrayal, resilience, and the moment a mother's silent war turned into a victory because of one brave voice. The courtroom was cold, not from the temperature, but from the way eyes glanced past her like she didn't belong there. Sarah sat still on the bench, her hands gripping a cheap plastic folder, the kind you'd find in a dollar store bin. Inside it were a few school attendance sheets, some photos of her kids smiling in a tiny kitchen, and a typed letter from her landlord saying she'd never once missed rent. Across from her sat Nathan, her ex-husband, surrounded by polished lawyers in dark suits. One of them stood confidently, pointing at charts on a screen. They were showing income statements, floor plans of Nathan's pristine home, pictures of his kids, her kids, dressed in designer clothes, playing in a wide green backyard. Sarah didn't have any of that. She didn't have a lawyer. She didn't have a green yard. She didn't even have new clothes on. The blazer she wore still had a loose thread under the collar, and the shoes were a half size too tight, borrowed from a neighbor down the hall who whispered, "Good luck," as Sarah left that morning holding her son's hand. Nathan hadn't even looked at her once. He sat relaxed, legs crossed, his arm draped on the back of his chair like it was just another meeting to win. His lawyer's voice cut through the silence again, this time sharper, like she wanted to draw blood. "Your Honor," she said, "the children deserve more than a mattress on the floor and boxed macaroni for dinner. This isn't about love. It's about stability. And my client can provide it. Miss Taylor cannot." Sarah flinched at the sound of her own name being tossed into a sentence like a problem that needed fixing. She glanced sideways at her daughter, Mia, who was quietly doodling flowers with a dull crayon on the edge of a court-issued paper. Her son, Ben, 7 years old, was sitting still, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes darting between his mom and his dad. Sarah could see the tightness in his mouth, the way he held his breath just a little longer than usual. He was trying to be strong. She wished she could take that burden off his little shoulders. The judge's face didn't give much away. He looked tired. Not unkind, just done. Like this was his 6th custody case of the day, and everything had started blending together. His eyes skimmed the documents from Nathan's side, nodding occasionally. Sarah wanted to scream. She wanted to say, "Look at me. Really look. I'm not perfect. I'm not rich. But I'm here. I show up. I'm their mother." But she stayed silent because that's what she was told to do at the legal clinic. Don't interrupt, don't cry too much, don't speak unless spoken to. That kind of advice made her feel like she wasn't a person anymore, just a problem in a courtroom checklist. She thought about the night before. Boiling water on the stove because the hot water was out again. Hand-washing school uniforms in the bathtub. Braiding Mia's hair in the dim light while pretending she wasn't crying. Taping Ben's shoes where the sole had started to separate. She thought about how he smiled anyway. How Mia sang little made-up songs while brushing her teeth. They were her heartbeat. And now they were sitting in front of a system that only saw numbers. Nathan's lawyer pulled out a sheet with a red circle around a bank balance. "This," she said, holding it up like evidence from a crime scene, "is what Miss Taylor has left in her checking account. $43.18. Sarah's face flushed. She wanted to shout that the rent was already paid, that the groceries were bought, that $43 meant she had made it through another month without asking for help. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Her throat burned. Not from tears, she'd cried all she could, but from the rawness of being picked apart in front of strangers. Her life laid out like a cautionary tale. But no one mentioned how Nathan had emptied their joint account the day he left. How he'd blocked her number for weeks, only to resurface with court papers and a new girlfriend on his arm. Sarah closed her eyes for a second just to breathe. When she opened them, the judge was asking her if she had anything to add. Her voice almost didn't come. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "I know I don't have much, but they're my kids. I've never missed a school meeting. I make their lunches, I hold them when they're scared. I may not be the parent with money, but I'm the one who's always there." The judge nodded politely but didn't say anything. Sarah sat down slowly. Her hands trembled. She kept them on her lap, hiding the way her nails dug into her skin. The lawyer continued talking. Something about educational resources, extracurricular activities, better future planning. Sarah barely heard it. Her focus was on her children, on making sure they felt her calm, not her fear. Just when it seemed like the judge was about to speak, to end this with a decision she already knew she couldn't fight, she felt a small tug on her sleeve. She turned. Ben was looking up at her, his lips pressed tight, his eyes wide with something urgent. "Mom," he whispered, "can I say something to the judge?" Sarah blinked. "What do you mean?" Ben reached into his little jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It looked worn, like it had been handled a lot. "I found this at Dad's house. In his drawer. It's about us. Can I show it to him?" Sarah's stomach twisted. She had no idea what it was. But she saw the way Nathan suddenly sat straighter. How his lawyer stopped mid-sentence and turned slowly toward Ben. The courtroom stilled. Every whisper, every shuffle of paper, every breath gone. Ben stood up. He didn't wait for permission. He walked toward the judge, holding the letter in both hands. Sarah didn't move. She just watched. Something was happening. Something she didn't expect. The judge looked confused but took the letter. He unfolded it. His brow creased. Then his eyes scanned the words and something changed in his face. The quiet in the room wasn't just stillness anymore. It was tension, thick and electric. Sarah could barely breathe. She didn't know what was on that page. But whatever it was real. Because Nathan wasn't relaxed anymore. He looked scared. And for the first time that day, so did his lawyer. That was the moment Sarah felt something shift. Not in the court but in herself. The moment a little boy's courage cracked open a wall that money and power had built. And she realized maybe, just maybe, she hadn't lost yet. Before Nathan, Sarah had her own place. It wasn't anything fancy but it was hers. A small apartment above a bakery, 2 rooms, chip tiles in the kitchen, and a bathroom mirror that always fogged up even when the water was cold. She used to laugh about that. She had a job back then, full-time at a community center, managing programs for kids after school. It didn't pay much, but it gave her purpose. She had coworkers who felt like friends, a regular routine, a beat-up car that took her where she needed to go, and a quiet sense of direction. Life was busy, sometimes hard, but it was hers. She paid her bills. She made her own choices. She knew who she was. Then Nathan walked in. It started like every fairy tale does, charming smiles, thoughtful texts, the kind of man who listened or at least pretended to. He showed up to her job once with flowers. Not roses. Daisies. "You look like a daisy girl," he'd said, and Sarah had smiled because she didn't know what that meant, but it sounded like something sweet. He was attentive in all the right ways, opening doors, bringing coffee, asking about her day. And when he talked about the future, it always had her in it. He made her feel seen, loved, like she mattered. When they got married, it felt like a step towards something stable, something better. Nathan had a good job in IT, and soon after the wedding, he started bringing up the idea that she didn't need to work anymore. "You work too hard," he'd say. "We don't need the extra income. You could rest for a bit, focus on home, maybe have kids." First, Sarah pushed back. She liked her job. She liked earning. But Nathan was persistent. "You've done enough," he repeated one night as he rubbed her shoulders. "Let me take care of us now." It sounded like love. It sounded like trust. So when she left her job, she told herself it was temporary. A year at most. Time to breathe, time to plan. But months passed and then a year and then came Ben. And suddenly the idea of going back felt farther and farther away. Nathan became the only one earning. First, it didn't feel like a loss. He still asked her opinions about money, still said we, when talking about bills or vacations. But slowly the language shifted. My paycheck. I'll decide. You don't understand how this stuff works. She didn't notice it all at once. It crept in between dinner conversations and late-night bills. Then came the little jabs. You've been home all day, why isn't the laundry done? We can't afford that unless you're bringing in something. Don't worry, I've got the finances. That's not your lane. He started giving her a monthly allowance. Like she was a teenager again. She had to ask him before buying something bigger than groceries. Sometimes he made her feel like she was stupid for asking. You don't know what things cost, he'd snap. Just leave it to me. After Mia was born, things got worse. Nathan wasn't cruel in ways you could point to. He didn't yell, not often. He didn't hit. But the silence cut deeper. The way he stopped listening, stopped asking. The way he rolled his eyes when she mentioned going back to work. Doing what? He'd ask with a laugh. You haven't updated a resume in 3 years. And it was true. She hadn't. Somewhere along the way, she'd stopped thinking about careers. She was busy being a mom, a wife, managing the house, handling all the invisible labor that kept everything from falling apart. But none of that counted as effort to Nathan. Not when she didn't bring home a paycheck. By year 5, Sarah felt like a guest in her own life. She didn't go out much. She didn't have time or energy for friends. Every outing needed planning, approval, explanation. Her days blurred into each other. Breakfast, dishes, diaper changes, laundry, bills. Nathan had built a world where everything ran through him, and she had slowly learned to disappear inside it. Sometimes she'd look in the mirror and wonder where the old version of her had gone, the girl who danced to the radio in the kitchen, who wore red lipstick just because. That girl was tired now. That girl stood in silence when her husband dismissed her in front of friends. That girl said, I'm fine, even when her chest felt heavy for days. The real unraveling started the day she found a message on his phone. She hadn't meant to see it. She was looking for a recipe using his phone because hers was dead. But there it was. A message from someone named T. Just a line. Last night was amazing. Same time next week. Her stomach dropped. At first she thought maybe it was old. Maybe it was nothing. But it wasn't. It was recent. She checked. And there were more. Weeks of messages. Late night calls. Hotel receipts. She sat on the bathroom floor and stared at the wall for an hour before she confronted him. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He just sighed like he was tired of pretending. We're not happy, Sarah. Let's stop faking it. 3 days later, he moved out. No warning, no real conversation. Just packed his things while she took the kids to school, left a note on the counter that said, I'll be in touch about custody. She thought maybe he'd help cover the rent. Maybe he'd leave the joint account alone. But when she went to buy milk that night, her card was declined. She checked online and saw the account was empty. Everything gone. The next day, a lawyer's letter showed up in her mailbox, asking for full custody of both kids. She hadn't even known he'd filed yet. She didn't cry right away. There wasn't time. The rent was due. The fridge was half empty. The power bill was already late. She started cleaning houses for cash. Under the table, no contracts, just handshakes and hours of scrubbing. She picked up shifts at night, leaving Mia with the neighbor's teenage daughter for a few dollars a night. She applied for food stamps, stood in line at the legal aid clinic, filled out forms with shaking hands. Every night she'd check the locks twice, then cry into a pillow so the kids wouldn't hear. She wasn't just broke. She was invisible. No one asked if she was okay. The people who used to call stopped checking in. Maybe they didn't know what to say. Maybe they didn't know what she needed. Or maybe they just didn't see her anymore. When she tried to get free legal advice, she had to wait weeks for an appointment. When she called about emergency housing programs, she was told the list was full. When she asked about child support, she was told it could take months to process. And all the while, Nathan smiled in court. Wore tailored suits. Talked about structure and opportunity and how the kids needed stability. He showed photos of birthday parties he hadn't paid for. He handed over report cards he barely asked about. And every time Sarah tried to speak, she felt like she was explaining her existence to people who had already decided she wasn't enough. It was a slow theft. Not of money, not just of comfort, but of identity. Nathan had taken her voice, her agency, her space in the world. He did it with charm, with control masked as care, with power disguised as protection. And by the time she realized what had happened, she was standing in a courtroom, fighting for her children with nothing in her hands but a cheap folder, a landlord's letter, and a hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. The hardest part wasn't the money. It was the noise in her own head. The voice that kept whispering, "You're failing them." Sarah woke up every morning before the sun, quietly so she wouldn't wake Ben or Mia. She moved through their little apartment on tiptoe, tying her hair back, washing her face in cold water because the heater barely worked. Some mornings there was no hot water at all. She'd boil water on the stove, pour it into a bucket, and bathe in silence, the steam fogging the cracked bathroom mirror. There were no long showers, no relaxing moments. Just rinse, dress, and go. She worked 2 cleaning jobs. One started at 6 a.m., scrubbing offices before employees showed up. The other was in the evenings, mopping floors in a small shopping center. She got both jobs through word of mouth. Under the table, no benefits, no job security, just cash in an envelope and a reminder to keep quiet. But it was something. Her hands were always raw from bleach, and her back ached from bending. She didn't complain. She couldn't. There was no time for pity, no energy for resentment. Every dollar mattered. Every shift kept the lights on, the fridge stocked, the rent paid. Rent was always first. Food came second. She didn't buy new clothes for herself. She wore the same 3 pairs of jeans on rotation, patched knees and all. The kids didn't have much either, but she searched thrift stores, picked through clearance bins, accepted hand-me-downs from neighbors without pride, just gratitude. Their apartment was small. 1 bedroom. Sarah gave that to the kids. She slept on a fold-out mattress in the living room, close enough to hear if one of them cried in the night. The walls were thin. She could hear the upstairs couple fighting most nights, their angry voices muffled through the ceiling. The kitchen was barely big enough for 2 people, but she made it work. She cooked simple meals, macaroni, rice, scrambled eggs. Sometimes all they had was instant noodles, but she'd add frozen vegetables to make it feel more like dinner. One night the fridge broke. She sat on the floor in front of it, hands in her lap, staring at the little puddle forming beneath it. She didn't cry. She just sat there, listening to Mia hum softly in the next room while coloring. Later that week she sold her wedding ring online. She told herself it was just metal. It didn't mean anything anymore. She used the money to buy warm coats for the kids. Winter was coming, and the windows in the apartment let in too much wind. She couldn't afford internet, so she went to the library when she needed to fill out forms or check emails. She kept a prepaid phone with just enough minutes to make emergency calls or answer if the school rang. Every month, she prayed the phone wouldn't run out at the wrong time. Sometimes she had to choose between minutes or milk. The hardest days were when one of the kids got sick. No paid leave. No backup. She'd call out of work and lose income just to sit beside them on the couch, holding a thermometer and a washcloth. She couldn't afford a doctor unless it was an emergency, so she kept a drawer full of discount cold medicine and did her best. Still, she made it feel safe. She sang lullabies at bedtime. She made pillow forts on weekends. She drew stars on their ceilings with glow-in-the-dark stickers and called them magic skies. She read old library books aloud with different voices to make them laugh. They didn't know how close to the edge everything was. That was the goal. Sometimes she would cry in the shower, not because she was sad exactly, but because holding it in all day left her with nowhere else to put it. She didn't cry around them. Not ever. When Mia spilled juice on the rug, she smiled and cleaned it up. When Ben asked if they could go to the zoo and she had to say no for the 3rd time, she hugged him instead and said, "Next time, baby." He never whined. He just nodded and looked out the window like maybe next time would come on its own if he waited long enough. On Sundays when she didn't work, she cooked pancakes with whatever she had. She let the kids pour syrup and pretend it was a feast. They danced in their pajamas and called it Sunday party. That 1 hour of joy was their break from everything else. One afternoon, she came home to find Ben folding his clothes without being asked. He'd even matched the socks. When she thanked him, he shrugged and said, "You always look tired. I can help too." She had to turn away before he saw her eyes well up. She kept a notebook in the drawer by her bed. It wasn't a journal, just a place to write down everything she needed to do. Pay rent, find cheaper diapers, call the school, fix Mia's broken backpack strap, check the food pantry schedule, find new socks for Ben. She checked off each task like it was a battle one. Because that's what it was every day, another battle to survive with dignity. The worst moment came when she found a shut-off notice on the door. Gas and electricity due in 5 days. She had $43 in her account. No savings. No family to call. She thought about taking a loan, but the interest was too high. She thought about selling more, but there was nothing left. So she cleaned 4 houses that week instead of 2. She walked between jobs to save on bus fare. She skipped lunch every day and made it stretch. On the 5th day, she paid the bill in full, in cash. The clerk at the payment office looked surprised. "Cutting it close," he said with a chuckle. She smiled back, but her hand trembled as she held the receipt. That night, she curled up on the floor mattress, kids tucked in and breathing soft in the next room. She stared at the ceiling and whispered, "We're okay. We're still okay." It wasn't triumph. It was survival. But that was enough. And through it all, Ben and Mia smiled. They still believed in birthday candles and wishes, in story time and stickers. They didn't know how much their mom fought each day just to make sure they had that. Sarah never told them. She just fought harder. Not because she was a hero. Not because she wanted applause. But because they were hers. Because they looked at her with trust. Because they laughed in the hallway even when the heater went out and they wore 2 sweaters to bed. Because when she looked in their eyes, she remembered who she was before all the noise, before the pain, before Nathan. And slowly, quietly, she began to believe she might be able to build something again. Not tomorrow. Not all at once. But one bill paid, one smile protected, one morning survived at a time. The courtroom felt colder that day, like even the walls had already made up their minds. Sarah sat on the bench, her hands folded tightly over her lap, trying to keep them from shaking. Her back was straight, her eyes forward, just like the legal aid advisor had told her. Stay calm. Stay respectful. No matter what they say. But no one prepared her for the silence, the kind that stretches for too long, that makes your heartbeat feel too loud in your chest. Nathan sat 3 rows across, a calm expression on his face, arms crossed like this was already done. His lawyer, Carla Dean, stood beside him, flipping through a folder thick with documents, each one a carefully sharpened knife. Sarah had seen those papers before. Bank statements, apartment photos, copies of school lunch menus that highlighted how many times Ben and Mia had skipped a meal. Everything boiled down into numbers. Cold, precise numbers. None of it showed the truth. None of it showed the night she boiled water just to wash their clothes, or the way Ben hugged his sister tight when she cried from hunger and told her it would be okay. That wasn't on paper. That wasn't evidence. The judge entered and sat down with a kind of weary authority. His eyes scanned the room, then landed on Carla. "You may proceed," he said. Carla stepped forward, voice steady, practiced. "Your Honor, we present evidence that Ms. Taylor is unable to provide the necessary stability for her children. Her residence is temporary. Her employment is undocumented. Her children are at risk." Sarah held her breath as Carla held up the images like trophies. One was a picture of their tiny apartment kitchen, taken during a surprise welfare check. The sink was full. There was a dish towel on the floor. Sarah remembered that day. Mia had spilled soup. There wasn't time to clean it before the social worker arrived. Next came the printout of Sarah's prepaid phone bill, the one with limited minutes. This phone is her only means of contact. What if a child is injured? What if the school can't reach her? Carla asked, turning to face the judge like she was reading straight from a manual titled How to Destroy a Mother. Sarah felt the heat rise in her chest, but she swallowed it. She had to stay quiet. She wasn't allowed to cry too much. Wasn't allowed to interrupt. The rules were clear. Show too much emotion and they'd call you unstable. Show too little and you didn't care enough. So she did the only thing she could. She looked down at her hands and focused on the soft, rhythmic drawing sounds beside her. Mia was doodling on a spare envelope with a borrowed pen. Ben sat silent, watching. Carla went on. "Mr. Whitman," she gestured toward Nathan, "has a steady income, a secure home, reliable transportation. He can offer the children their own bedrooms, nutritious meals, and access to private education. This is not about punishing Miss Taylor. This is about doing what is best for the children." Sarah could see the judge nodding slightly. Not in agreement maybe, but in understanding. And that was worse somehow. She could feel the ruling before it even came. She wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and say, "That house may be big, but it's not full of love. That money may buy food, but it doesn't buy peace." But her throat was too tight. Her tongue felt heavy. Her heart thudded with helplessness. And then came the final blow. Carla looked directly at Sarah, then said, "This is not about whether Miss Taylor loves her children. It is about whether she is capable of caring for them. And the evidence shows she is not." Hit like a slap. Sarah didn't move. She didn't blink. But something inside her cracked. The judge glanced down at his file. Sarah watched him inhale, lean back slightly. She could feel the verdict rising in his posture. Her chest tightened. Her eyes burned. She reached out and held Ben's hand, squeezing it gently. And then she felt it, that little tug on her arm. "Mom," Ben whispered. She turned slowly, unsure if she was even breathing at that point. "Can I say something to the judge?" he asked. She stared at him, stunned. "What do you mean?" Ben reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "It's from Dad's safe. I found it last week. I think it's important." Sarah didn't even have time to respond. Ben stood up. His legs were short but sure. He walked past the row of benches, past Carla, past Nathan, who froze in his seat. "Excuse me, Your Honor," Ben said, his voice soft but clear. "I have something to show you." The courtroom paused. The kind of pause that changes things. The judge raised his eyebrows. "Come forward, son," he said. Ben handed him the paper. The judge unfolded it slowly. Carla's jaw tightened. Nathan shifted in his seat. The judge read silently at first, his eyes moving across the page. Then something changed. His eyebrows pulled together. He read it again. Then again. "Mr. Whitman," he said without looking up, "would you like to explain this?" Nathan blinked. "Explain what?" he asked, voice a little too fast. "This letter," the judge said, holding it up, "is a financial planning memo, dated 3 months before the divorce. It outlines methods to hide income, open shell accounts, and frame the petitioner," he glanced at Sarah, "as financially unstable." There was a ripple in the courtroom, a sudden drop in the air, like everyone had just realized they'd been watching the wrong side win. Sarah couldn't move. She looked at Ben, who looked up at her with those wide, serious eyes, and said, "I didn't want us to lose." The judge set the paper down, his face unreadable. He turned back to Nathan. "This court will be reviewing this document thoroughly. In the meantime, custody will remain with Miss Taylor. This hearing is suspended pending investigation." The words didn't sink in right away. Sarah sat still, her arms around Mia now, Ben leaning into her side. Carla said nothing. Nathan didn't even stand. Sarah closed her eyes and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for weeks. Not because it was over. Not because she had won. But because for once someone had listened. And it wasn't the judge. It wasn't the lawyers. It was her son. Her 7-year-old son, who stood up when no adult in the room had the courage to. That day didn't end with applause. There was no dramatic scene, no music, no victory lap. Just a mother holding her children a little tighter. Just a boy who saw wrong and tried to make it right. And in a courtroom built on paperwork and strategy, it was truth, raw and simple, that made everything stop. When the judge took the letter from Ben's small hands, the whole courtroom seemed to lean in, like the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah didn't move. She couldn't. Her fingers were still clutching the edge of the bench, her mind racing in slow motion. She had no idea what was on that paper. Ben had never mentioned it, never said a word about digging through Nathan's things. But as she watched the judge unfold the page, watched his eyes narrow and then widen slightly, she knew. She didn't know what exactly, but she knew it was big. Carla's lips pressed into a thin, hard line. Nathan didn't blink. For a moment, no one even breathed. The judge read silently at first, then again slower. The lines in his forehead deepened. When he finally spoke, his voice was sharp, clear, and louder than before. "Mr. Whitman, would you like to explain this?" Nathan shifted, tried to keep his composure, but Sarah saw it, the first sign of panic. He opened his mouth, closed it, then forced a thin smile. I don't know what that is. It must be. I haven't seen. The judge cut him off. This is a document from Elridge and Beckett Financial Consulting, dated 3 months before your divorce was filed. It outlines specific steps for financial shielding, asset transfers, and strategies to limit spousal and child support exposure. It includes shell companies, offshore accounts, and manipulation of reported income. He paused and stared straight at Nathan. It also includes a line that reads, and I quote, "Retain primary custody if possible, or at minimum, ensure petitioner has no financial grounds for legal appeal. Appear stable and morally secure at all costs." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. It was like a door had finally opened. All those times Nathan had brushed off her suspicions, told her she was being paranoid, told her she didn't understand how money worked. All of it was suddenly so clear. Carla turned toward Nathan, whispering something through clenched teeth. He leaned back slightly, eyes darting around the room. Sarah's breath came slowly now. She watched the judge carefully fold the letter and place it in front of him on the bench. He adjusted his glasses, looked over the rim, and spoke again. This court will be suspending this hearing pending a formal investigation into Mr. Whitman's financial conduct. Custody will remain with Ms. Taylor during the inquiry. Mr. Whitman's visitation is also temporarily suspended until this matter is resolved. It took Sarah a moment to register what he said. The words were clear, direct, and yet she felt like they were floating just out of reach, like her brain needed extra time to believe them. Mia stopped drawing. Ben looked up at her. "Did I mess up?" he whispered. Sarah pulled him close, kissed the top of his head. "No, baby. You didn't mess up. You did exactly the right thing." Carla didn't argue. She gathered her paper stiffly, lips tight, as if trying to hold in the fallout. Nathan didn't say a word. He just stared ahead, expression hollow. The judge stood and left the bench. The bailiff dismissed the room. People began to shuffle out, still whispering. Sarah stayed seated. She didn't move until the room had mostly emptied. Outside, the air was cold and dry. Sarah pulled both kids close as they stepped into the gray afternoon. She still didn't feel triumphant, just exhausted. But beneath that exhaustion, something had cracked open. A sense of something deeper than survival. A glimpse of justice. That night, she didn't sleep much. She kept replaying the moment in her mind. The look on the judge's face, the tone in his voice, the way Nathan had squirmed for the first time. She thought about the letter. The way Ben had quietly carried it, probably for days, without knowing exactly what it meant, just knowing that it mattered. He had found it while looking for his tablet, tucked behind some folders in the safe that Nathan kept in his home office. He had read enough to realize it wasn't normal, and somehow he had decided to bring it with him, holding on to it until the moment felt right. Sarah couldn't decide whether to feel proud or heartbroken. Maybe both. The next day, the court-appointed investigator called. Her name was Ms. Trent. Her voice was calm, neutral, but there was something firm behind it, like she'd been doing this long enough to recognize patterns. She set up a meeting at a public office near the courthouse. When Sarah arrived, Ms. Trent was already there. A notepad in front of her, a folder full of paperwork. She shook Sarah's hand and offered the kids coloring books while they waited in the lobby. Sarah sat down, her shoulders tight, but Ms. Trent wasn't like Carla. She didn't accuse. She didn't judge. She asked questions about their finances during the marriage, about Nathan's habits, about the timeline of events. Sarah answered everything she could. When Ms. Trent asked about the letter, Sarah said quietly, "I didn't know about it until the moment my son handed it over in court." Ms. Trent nodded, scribbled something down, and said, "That moment probably changed everything." She then asked permission to pull financial records, tax filings, bank activity, anything that could corroborate the contents of the letter. Sarah agreed without hesitation. She had nothing to hide. Over the next week, things started to unravel. Sarah received updates from Ms. Trent, a trail of shell companies in Nevada, wire transfers to offshore accounts, inconsistencies in tax declarations. It was all there, like a carefully constructed web that Nathan thought no one would ever see. But it was visible now, and it was breaking. Sarah didn't feel joy exactly, but she felt something unfamiliar: validation. A quiet kind of power she hadn't felt in years. For so long, she had been gaslit into doubting her own instincts, told she was imagining things, overreacting, ungrateful. But now the facts were speaking for themselves. She shared what she could with Ben in words simple enough for a 7-year-old. "That paper you gave the judge, it was important," she said one night while folding laundry on the floor. Ben looked up from his coloring book. "Am I in trouble?" he asked again. She shook her head and reached for his hand. "You were brave. You told the truth when no one else would. That's not trouble. That's being a hero." The next hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In that time, Sarah managed to find representation through a domestic support network. They gave her a lawyer, young, sharp, the kind of person who listened more than they talked. Sarah still didn't have new clothes, but she found a black dress at a donation center and paired it with a jacket she had ironed 3 times over. When she walked into that courtroom again, she walked taller. Nathan looked different too. The smugness was gone. His new lawyer was quiet,